Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly analysis of major economic trends and developments, changes in the way we earn our incomes, spend our money, borrow, all the economic dimensions of our lives. My name is Richard Wolff. I'm the host of this Economic Update program. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, and I currently teach at the New School University in New York City. I also write columns for Shoutouts.org, a courageous, independent source of news and analysis every day. Check them out at Shoutouts.org. If this program and the kinds of analyses we offer interest you and make you think, then please know that you can get a great deal more of this sort of material at our two websites, rdwolff.com and democracyatwork.info. The first will give you speeches and interviews and papers that I write, and the second one is more focused on workers' self-directed enterprises, worker co-ops, a key part of the solution we think is needed to get this country going again and to go beyond the limits of a capitalism that isn't working very well anymore. Both those websites allow you to send comments and questions, criticisms, and your own thoughts to us, and so please make use of them in that way. You can also regularly visit these websites to get updates of various kinds on the stories we follow. Once again, rdwolff.com and democracyatwork.info. And you can also follow us, of course, on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. I want to do a couple of short shout-outs, you might call them, because of my activities in the last week. I had the occasion to do fundraising presentations in both San Francisco and Los Angeles. I was hosted there by stations KPFA in San Francisco and KPFK in Los Angeles. In addition to wanting publicly to thank those stations for their support and all the work they did to make these meetings happen, I was also blown away, frankly, by the sheer number of people. Roughly 1,500 people in those two cities came out to listen to and participate in a conversation about what's happening and what ought to happen in our economy. Very, very encouraging, and I want to thank those who came as well. We've been thinking this period of time about Martin Luther King, as have so many Americans. And so my attention was caught for this program by a labor dispute currently happening in Memphis, which is where Dr. King was assassinated. And in Memphis, the Kellogg Corporation, you know, the company that makes your breakfast cereal, is in a fight with its workers, most of whom are African American, as is most of the city of Memphis. And they had a dispute when Kellogg, back in October, wanted to start hiring casual and part-time workers at much lower pay rates than they pay their normal union workers. They're represented by the bakery, confectionery, tobacco worker, and grain millers, local 252G. And the workers said, no, you can't do that. We have a contract here, and you have an obligation to hire full-time workers and pay the agreed salaries and benefits. Kellogg responded by locking the workers out. And that lockout, denying income and work to hundreds of workers, continues as I am speaking. So Kellogg, which produced there in Memphis two of its more famous products, Frosted Flakes and Fruit Loops, finds itself damaging the interests and needs of the African American majority workers in its Memphis plant. It's also moving production, of course, to where they can pay even lower wages, in this case Mexico, where millions and millions of pounds of cereal are now produced that used to be produced in Memphis. You might want to think about all of this in connection with all that Martin Luther King stood for And you might want to think about it next time you're walking down the aisles and considering the companies that stand behind the products sitting on those aisles. Another short item. A very famous writer in the Financial Times, probably the most widely read financial daily in the world, from England, one of their most famous writers is a man named Martin Wolff. No relation, he spells his name with one F, and I do with two. But he has an interesting column in the middle of January 2014, where he basically says that he's very worried about the world economy, that it is splitting into a tiny group of, he calls them elites, who face a mass of people whom they are not properly treating. That's kind of his argument. And he warns these elites that if they continue to behave the way they have, enriching themselves at the expense of everybody else, making political deals that flaunt and contravene what the mass of people want, they're setting themselves up for a very dangerous future. And I thought I'd read to you the final lines of his January 14 piece in the Financial Times. The result of all these mistakes made by the elites, he says, is the birth of angry populism throughout the West, mostly the xenophobic populism of the right. The characteristic of right-wing populists is that they kick down. And here comes the key sentence. If elites continue to fail, we will go on watching the rise of angry populists. The elites need to do better. If they do not, rage may overwhelm us all. Well, I don't think in terms of elites. I'm much more interested in how in the world an economic system can produce elites in the first place. How it can produce tiny groups of people with absurdly disproportional amounts of wealth, income, and power. If we were able to get to a system that didn't give small groups of people such situations, such outsized income, wealth, and power, we wouldn't need to worry about what elites do or don't do, understand or don't understand. In short, I'm not hoping to solve the problems of our economy by persuading elites to be less selfish, less greedy, and less power-driven than they currently are. Good luck to those who imagine that's possible. I'm more interested in changing the economic system so we don't have to worry about elites in the first place. As we turn to our updates for this program, I want to mention first a remarkable story from the Bloomberg News Agency about a study of the first couple of years of the free online courses offered by Harvard and MIT. Hundreds of these courses made available free. And here's a statistic that has just been released that I think is worth our thinking about. Of the 842,000 people who registered for these free courses offered by Harvard and MIT, 95% never completed the course. A majority of those who registered dropped out within the first few weeks. What is the message here? Well, there used to be a great deal of hype about online courses, about them being the wave of the future, about the revolution in education as we switch from the classroom to the video screen on our home computer. It was thought that this was going to be, in the glowing terms of some enthusiasts, the democratization of education, making it literally available to everybody in a way that had never been done before. This statistic raises serious doubts, to say the least, about all of that. In my own experience, and all my adult life has been in higher education in the United States. The real attraction of online courses was for administrators, not professors and not students, in and out of the university. Administrators saw this as an immense saving of money. Instead of hiring many professors, you'd hire a handful, do a video of them teaching whatever they do, and then show it to endless numbers of people at virtually no cost. Pay the professor once and rake in the fees from students forever afterwards, or at least for 5 or 10 years before you did it all again. In other words, money drove this story, not education, and certainly not democracy. And here's also a word of warning about such dreams. The way you teach people is with an intense interpersonal relationship. Teacher and student, whether at home, in the classroom, on the job, anywhere, is a complicated relationship like all human relationships. It happens best if it has time, if it has support, if it has encouragement. The complex way that a teacher can not only convey material, but convey an excitement about learning, an appreciation of how much better life is if you have a grasp of what's going on around you. That's not so easy to do in a large lecture room, and it is much harder to do in the anonymity of a video screen and a person you can't see or talk to or interact with. If you're committed to education, let alone to democratic education, you would have to create many more opportunities at large sums of money for people to interact in small seminar, workshop, classroom situations with the time and the support to really learn. That is the future for any society. And the idea that we're not going to do it, or we're going to try to shortcut it by some video program at a distance, is absurd and not a little dishonest. The fact that 95% of those who took the time and trouble to register for the Harvard MIT courses didn't stay with it should teach us a major lesson. The next update has to do with a topic that is of enormous interest to Americans, perhaps more now than ever. And that's the gap between rich and poor. And this last week, Oxfam, OXFAM, released a report called Working for the Few, actually on Monday of January 20th. And this was written up on NBC News, no less, by Leanne Wong, a CNBC reporter. And I want to summarize what she said there because I found it, even though I'm familiar with these statistics, rather stunning in what it had to say. According to this report, 210 people became billionaires last year. They joined a select group of 1,426 individuals with a combined net worth of $5.4 trillion. That means that if you look at these people, they, and we're talking here about 1,600 people in the world, have as much money as a third of the output every year of the entire United States, the richest and most powerful economy in the world. Another way to look at it, Oxfam said, was if you take the richest 1% of the people in the world, they now own $110 trillion worth of wealth. And that is 65 times the wealth of the bottom half of the population of our planet. This is an overwhelmingly unequal distribution of wealth. This is a more extreme distribution of wealth than you had in ancient Egypt with the pharaohs sitting on top of mountains of wealth and the mass of people hauling the stones that made the pyramids that those pharaohs created for their own funerals and their own headstones. It means that modern capitalism has a record of producing inequality on an absolutely staggering scale, for which, as with the case of the pharaohs, there is and was no justification. If we don't want the absurd injustice of 1% of the people having more wealth than 65 times the wealth of the poorer half of the billions that inhabit this earth, then we have to deal with a capitalism that brought this inequality to us. Finally, in Oxfam's report, there is the example of India. And I want to mention it because it shows that as capitalism explodes in parts of the world where it was not explosive before, I'm talking about China, India, Brazil, Russia, and so on, the same awful inequality is being generated by capitalism. So, for example, in India over the last 10 years, the number of billionaires went from 6, this is a country with over 1 billion people in it, 6 billionaires 10 years ago to 61 billionaires today. And if you look at those 61 billionaires in a country of 1.2 billion people, those 61 individuals owned property that went from 1.8% in 2003 to 26% in 2008. Grotesque inequality is the gift capitalism brings to the countries where it becomes dominant. As if it weren't enough, I thought I'd bring the inequality home here to the United States and talk about one small example that is nonetheless emblematic in a profound way. This has to do with the CEO, Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, our nation's best-known coffee company. He is now the highest-paid CEO in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Actually, it's the 4th year that he has that remarkable title to his name. But he's also engaged in a struggle in San Jose because activists in San Jose, California, are angry at Starbucks for seeking a special exemption so they don't have to pay the living wage that the city of San Jose passed, a wage which is imposed on everybody doing business with the city. You have to pay, if you want the city's business, what's called a living wage. The living wage is $15.78 an hour. Wow. And Mr. Schultz doesn't want to have to pay it. And so, Too Much Online, Sam Pizzigotti's remarkable newsletter, pointed out that Mr. Starbucks, that is Mr. Howard Schultz, earns from Starbucks $9,637 an hour, or 1,096 times the average Starbucks hourly wage rate. In other words, Starbucks can afford to pay almost $10,000 an hour to its chief executive, but doesn't want to pay $15.78 an hour to workers in San Jose. As Sam Pizzigotti points out in his newsletter, you really have to love Howard Schultz and Starbucks, even more when it turns out that in his 2011 memoir, he wrote the following sentence: "I love Starbucks because everything we've tried to do is steeped in humanity." I can say nothing that tops that. Final update, short update for this part of the program, is a Gallup poll, also released in the middle of January 2014, that looks over a 10-year period at how Americans feel about where the nation stands. And I wanted to pick on one question, the state of the nation's economy. Random Americans were asked back in 2004, and then again between January 5th and 8th of 2014, so over an exact 10-year period, January 2001 to January 2014. So we're talking that many years, this century so far, the state of the nation's economy. What percentage of those asked said they were either very or somewhat satisfied with the state of the nation's economy? In 2001, 68%, 2/3 of Americans said they were either somewhat or very satisfied with the state of our economy. This year, January 2014, that had dropped to 28%, a drop of 40 percentage points, from 2/3 who were satisfied to 1/4 that is satisfied. The media, the academics, and our political leaders may be speaking about recovery, about things looking up, but the mass of the American people, polled by Gallup, clearly think otherwise. And I do too. Let me turn now to the first of our major discussions for today's program. And as has happened before, and because it is such an important topic for Americans and for a program on economics, I want to talk about unemployment. Much has been said about, again, the recovery we are supposed to be experiencing. And as I have said to you before, that is a fantasy. Recovery applies only to the stock market, to rich corporations and wealthy individuals whose income depends on the stock market. For the vast majority of the American people, there is no recovery. So let's turn to unemployment and see what those statistics tell us. Here, in simplest terms, is the reality. In the last year before the crisis hit, 2007, unemployment averaged during the year 4.8%. That's millions of people unemployed, but 4.8% was the number the government gave. In the depths of the crisis of the last 6 years, late 2009, early 2010, unemployment reached 10%. What is it today? 6.7%. Okay, folks, that's roughly halfway back to where we were in 2007. The word recovery means you're back to where you were. We are not back to where we were. To be back to where we were, we'd need 4.8%. We have 6.7%, which, unless I've forgotten my arithmetic, is nowhere near 4.8%. We're barely halfway back, and no guarantee whatsoever that it will get better. Okay, well then how are Republicans and Democrats dealing with this unemployment catastrophe? The Republicans have done everything in their power to support austerity programs in Washington, raising taxes on average Americans the way they did at the beginning of 2013 by raising the payroll tax a whopping 40%. And they've gotten the Democrats to go along, not only with raising taxes on average people, but by cutting spending, the so-called sequester that kicked in last March, the cutting back of all kinds of government programs. This situation has, of course, meant that if you raise taxes, people have less money to spend, and if the government itself spends less, less goods and services will be purchased, and that is never good for improving unemployment. And the Republicans not only blocked doing something about really solving unemployment, but they got the Democrats to go along. And no sooner had they gotten the Democrats to go along with raising the payroll tax and with the sequester cuts to government spending, then they turned around and blamed Obama for the economy not doing better than it was, for this poor, lackluster performance now stretched out over the entire 6 years 2008 through 2013. What have the Democrats done? Well, they were complicit in austerity, but to be fair, they tried to make it less austere than the Republicans wanted. But now that the Republicans are attacking Obama and the Democrats for a poor performance in getting us out of the economic mess, they need to turn around, which is what they've been doing, and to pretend that there is a recovery, to try to refute the Republicans by imagining that there's something going on that isn't there, namely a recovery. So they pretend. And unfortunately, liberal folks and even some radical folks are being taken for a ride around the notion of supporting Obama by joining in the hyped pretense that there's a recovery. Who's the winner in this absurd political theater that is irrelevant to the underlying economic reality? The answer is corporations and the rich. They're not being taxed, not even the way they were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're not being taxed to provide the kind of real employment program that even a Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s was forced to do. We don't have a government employment program hiring millions the way we did in the 30s. We don't have a boost to Social Security the way we did in the 1930s. We're cutting back. And that's good for the people who had to pay in the 1930s. Corporations and the rich. They avoid that problem now. And that's what the theater between Republicans and Democrats is about. And, as I have to sadly say, that's what it's mostly been about in the history of the United States. A distraction, a weapon of mass distraction, while the underlying business of the economy, producing the unspeakable inequality we talked about earlier, continues on its merry way. And we listen to the politicians on both parties say things, none of which are relevant, and few of which are even true. Unemployment is an index. It's a sign of a country's economic failure. And this is a basic point that I cannot get across often enough. And here it is in its simplest formulation. Unemployment now, 6.7%, means that somewhere upwards of 10 million people in the United States are looking for work and can't find it. We know there are 3 times more people looking than there are want-ad openings for people. 10 million people. And that doesn't count the people who have stopped looking and given up. And it doesn't count the people who have part-time jobs, even though they need and want full-time. Just those people looking and finding nothing. 10 million. Alongside of them, unemployment has to be understood as involving the non-employment of tools, equipment, machines, office, store, factory space, sitting idle, doing nothing, available for production, but not in production. So our unemployment means we have 10 million people who were looking for and want to work. And we have, according to the Federal Reserve, 1/5 of our tools, equipment, raw materials, floor, and office space empty, unused. We could put those 10 million to work doing important work because all of the raw materials, tools, and equipment they need are available. And if they did, we could produce wealth in America to rebuild our cities, overcome poverty, help the rest of the world on a stunning scale. But our capitalist system can't put the people who want to work together with the idle tools, equipment, and raw materials to generate the wealth that would make us better off. Nothing is a more profound criticism of capitalism than that colossal failure, that enormous inefficiency that drowns out the chorus of those who want us to believe that capitalism is the best thing since sliced bread. We are midway in our program. This is Economic Update. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. We will take a short break. Stay with us. We will be right back.
All right. Okay, we're gone.
Welcome back, friends. This is Economic Update. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. Before we get into the second half of today's show, I want to remind you that if the updates and analyses that I present are of interest to you, if you'd like to pursue any of them, please visit the two websites we maintain and update continuously for all the links, associations, documents that will be of interest to you. The first is rdwolf with 2fs.com, and the second is democracyatwork.info. The second of our major topics for discussion was brought to my attention through an article in the Wall Street Journal during January, Wall Street Journal Online during January of 2014. And in turn, I want to thank one of our Economic Update listeners in Australia, where we have a sizable audience, I am proud to say, who brought this to my attention, and her kindness in doing that is much appreciated. Here's what this article is about. But before I tell you, and we analyze it, I want to mention to you who the authors are. There are two authors. They are both professional economists, like myself, and they're both lifelong professors of economics, like myself. But there the similarity, as you will see, ends. The first one is Gary Becker. He is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, a longtime professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and likewise associated with the Hoover Institute in Stanford University. As I said, there the differences are clear. I have not won a Nobel Prize. I have no association with the University of Chicago or with the Hoover Institute. However, I did study for a part of my life at Stanford University. The second author of this paper I'm going to describe to you is Julio Elias. He's a professor at the Universidad del CEMA in Argentina. Becker and Elias have written an article about creating a market for human organs. And in particular, they're interested in this article in creating a market for kidneys. So here's the argument, and I think it's important for a sign of what people who endorse capitalism and who celebrate market economies, both capitalist markets and other kinds of markets, here's the way they think, spelled out in an unusually blunt way, and therefore creating an opportunity for us to see what's going on with the folks who think markets are wonderful and should be extended. The argument of Becker and Elias is to extend the market for such things as shirts and hamburgers and software programs to include human kidneys. So they begin with something quite true, that the waiting list for kidney transplants is much larger than the available supply of human kidneys. In other words, more people want and need a kidney transplant than there are kidneys available, and that creates a waiting list. While people are waiting, they use dialysis, but the statistics show you don't live as long if you depend on dialysis as you can live if you get another person's kidney to replace your own diseased or defective one. And they also talk about the immense costs and the loss of life associated with the shortage of kidneys. And remember that most kidneys are obtained from people who have died and made their organs available, and that they're harvested, in a sense, from people that are no longer with us. They wish to create a market that would allow people who are living to donate one kidney, and also people who are willing to donate for when they're dead, if they get paid now. The idea of Becker and Elias is pay for kidneys. If you pay for kidneys, they argue simply, more people will donate them. And if more people donate them, you will save lives and shorten waiting lists, etc. Okay, they recognize, as I suspect most of you do, that there is something not quite reasonable or maybe even ethical or maybe morally acceptable about having a market in human organs. I might mention that human beings all through history have found certain things to be inappropriate for markets, and they've balked at letting the enthusiasts for markets tell them in their excitement that everything should be distributed by a market. That is, everything in the world should go from the producer of it to the consumer of it by means of a market exchange. So, for example, sexual services, sexual pleasure that can be provided by one person to another, through most of human history, societies, including our own, have resisted creating a market in that. In other words, prostitution is declared to be illegal. You are not legally allowed to sell or buy sexual services. The same is applied, for example, to all kinds of drugs, and so on and so on. Things are excluded from markets, and human organs have usually been among them. But Mr. Becker and Mr. Elias, they don't want to be held back. They want us to believe that markets, creating a market, is the appropriate way to deal with the shortage of kidneys, human kidneys, available for transplants for people who need them. Now let me be clear. Do I want to help solve this problem? Yes. Would I like to see there be more kidneys available from people who can reasonably part with them, either because they have themselves died or because of their own attitude towards sharing an organ and living with one kidney and going through a kidney removal, which, while not extremely dangerous, always carries the risks that any major surgery does? Yeah, I think all of that is reasonable to pursue. How do we get this problem solved? But to use a market to do it, I find offensive in the extreme. And I want to talk about that, because that's an economic issue. The example, the model that Becker and Elias use to show how wonderful it would be and how much of a solution to the shortage of kidneys it would be if we created a market, put an amount of money. By the way, they don't shy away. $15,000 for a kidney is what they propose. The model they use is a voluntary army. Now let's be clear here what they mean. Until a few years ago, the military was having trouble getting enough volunteers to put enough people in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, etc., for what the generals considered the number they needed, along with the President and the Congress. It's a problem like not having enough kidneys. They didn't have enough volunteers to make up the military force they wanted. Well, says Becker, you could, of course, have a draft. You could have a way that everybody, for example, everybody who reaches a certain age, goes into a pool, and then you randomly select from that pool who is going to serve in the Army. The alternative to that is a volunteer army, namely, you hope that you will get enough people. And what do you do when you don't have enough people? Well, it turns out we were in that situation a few years ago, but the situation turned around. The history of this, Becker and Elias leave out, and I can see why. Here's what happened. The United States went into a catastrophic economic crash and decline, starting in late 2007. Millions of people were thrown out of work. Millions of people saw their wages decline, their benefits evaporate, the security of their job disappear. The reason volunteers for the Army shot up is the same reason volunteers for armies usually shoot up. It's because the economic conditions, the possibilities, and the opportunities for poor people are becoming severe. And as young men and women face poor or no job opportunities, the Army looks good. The Navy looks attractive. There you can go, get an income. Oh, granted, it isn't much, but they pay for your room and board too. It's poverty and economic decline that produce a volunteer army. And it means that those people who have money and don't need to worry about jobs, or those people who have decent job opportunities, they don't need to consider the military. They don't find a military job or career very attractive. They don't go. And the end result is you don't need a draft because you have enough people. But the people you get in your Army, Navy, and Air Force are driven there by economic necessity in huge numbers. Or to say the same thing in real plain English, you make poor people fight for rich people. That's the model. And they're going to do the same, if they get their way, Becker and Elias, with your organs. Because if you pay $15,000 for a kidney, you know who's going to be most tempted? The poor, for whom that is a stunning amount of money that they cannot, legally at least, get so easily anywhere else. So the poor will give up a kidney, and they will take the risk of the operation, and they will take the risk of the complications. The poor will solve the problem. That's what markets do. They solve problems at the expense of the poor and in favor of the rich. Is that what we want? Rather than a program to get millions more Americans to think seriously about donating organs after their death, especially if their death is premature and they're still relatively young. Is that a way to induce people who want to share with another person the life-saving benefits of an organ transplant? Do we really want to do that by having poor people do it for everybody else? Is that consistent with religious, moral, and ethical commitments? Is that democratic, even just a tiny bit? I don't think so. And that leads me to conclude this discussion with a more general comment about markets. Let's be clear what markets are and what markets do, since we live in a society in which markets are treated as if they were God's creation and gift to the human race, some sort of perfect allocation mechanism that appropriately decides who gets what. Let's put away those ideological fantasies. Let's be clear here. A market is a way of distributing resources and the products of human labor. Here's how markets work. You get it if you have the money to buy it. A market distributes goods according to people's ability to pay. If there's not enough to go around of anything, bidding starts in a market. People bid for what is not there in enough quantity so everybody to get some. If there's not enough, you bid. And you know who wins the bidding? The person eager and able to pay the most. Markets allocate scarce goods to those who have the most money. The market doesn't care whether you got the money by inheriting it, by working for it, by stealing it. They don't care. Markets are neutral. So the rich people find in markets the mechanism that serves them first and foremost. And if you don't have a lot of money, the market gives you the lesser quantity, the lesser quality, or none at all. The Mercedes-Benz goes to the people with a lot of money. It doesn't go to the people who don't have a lot of money. Is that a reasonable way to distribute goods and services? Just ask yourself that simple question. Do you want scarce goods and services to be distributed among people who need them according to how much money they have? So the need really is irrelevant because the distribution goes to those who have the money. We have millions of people who are homeless in America today and in other countries. They can't afford to buy a home or to rent it. Meanwhile, we have other people who have 6 houses. They have a lot of money. They can't even live in all the 6 houses, but they have them because we distribute housing according to a market. Have we always done that? No. Have we always done it even in recent times? No. When your mother makes a lovely meal for the family, when she's finished making it, does she distribute it to all the members of the family gathered around the dinner table by a market? By giving the nicest piece of meat to whoever hands her the biggest wad of bills? I don't think so. You'd find that revolting. Families don't distribute amongst themselves in a market mechanism, do they? During World War II, when the United States wanted all Americans to be part of the shared war effort, they decided not to allow a market to distribute scarce goods, gasoline, sugar, meat, flour, milk, butter, and so on. They felt rightly that if you allowed the market to distribute those things which were scarce at that time because we were fighting a war, then only the rich people would get those things and the poor people would be denied them. And that, our leaders thought, would not be good for the unity needed to fight a war. So we didn't allow markets to distribute that. We distributed by means of a rationing system. The government printed up ration cards, and they distributed them to Americans. And the only way you could get sugar, meat, gasoline, butter, and so on was if you had a ration card. Money by itself didn't do the job. And here comes the kicker. How were ration cards distributed by the government? According to need. If you had a big family, you got more cards for milk than if you didn't. Oh, wow. The government of the United States suspended the market and came up with a better system, it thought, distribution according to need, something a market does not do. Oh, what's the conclusion? We ought to think about markets. Markets are the mechanism of distribution most preferred by the rich, because they're the ones who can get the market to serve them. It is therefore a profound mystery how and why middle and lower income people could have been, and still often are, persuaded that they too ought to celebrate a market, even though it discriminates against them systematically. Let me turn now, finally, in the minutes we have left, to some of your questions. The first one, which is often asked to me, has to do with Europe. And it says the following. If Europe's economic crisis is right now worse than that of the United States, and basically that's true. They have much higher unemployment in many countries, not all. They have much greater suffering in terms of their economic conditions. It is softened by the fact that they have a safety net, social programs for their people that are much more generous in general than we have in the United States, so that individuals are suffering in many ways less than here. But it's an economic crisis of severe proportions. So here's the question. Is this because they have a generous safety net? Are European economies in trouble the way they are because they can't afford or shouldn't afford paying for a national health insurance, which almost all of them do, providing for all kinds of subsidies, free public education, required paid vacations from employers, and so on. I want to say as clearly and emphatically as I know how that that is not the case. I could give you all the different arguments about how and why this crisis came about because of what financiers did, the risks they took with other people's money, the illegal acts they engaged in that made the risk worse, the refusal to raise wages and therefore plunge working class people into unsustainable debts. Those are the real factors that brought this crisis and that have plunged Europe into its dilemma. But I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to give you a simpler way of understanding it. That country in Europe, which has done the best through this crisis, whose unemployment not only has recovered, but its unemployment never went up in the crisis. Its unemployment has been going down steadily from 2007 to the present. The country that is the envy of everyone in Europe, and indeed of the United States, for those who know, is Germany. Germany is having an economic boom of these years. Germany is having economic growth, which is the best in the West. It's not as spectacular as that of China, but it is profoundly better than what we have in the United States. And Germany has one of the most generous public welfare, subsidy, safety net, whatever you want to call it, of any country in the world. So clearly, providing for your people is not some cause of economic distress, because the Germans provide big time, and they're the best off, way better than the countries that are having difficulty. And France, the other large country in Europe, economically speaking, is quite similar. To remind you, French and Germans have a government-provided health insurance. Doesn't matter whether you're working or not, old or young, you're covered for every medical requirement. In both countries, employers provide several weeks of paid vacation from the day you start working. In both countries, higher education is subsidized and close to free. In France, a subsidy is provided if you have more than one child to help you raise the child and give it the nurturing and support it needs, and on and on and on. These countries are doing quite well, thank you. But Germany above all. So does providing a safety net and social welfare for your people lead to economic crisis? Not at all. You're going to have to look for the causes of crisis elsewhere. And the people who say that providing welfare to your people is an economic line to disaster, they're really just trying to distract you from the financial shenanigans, the jobs that are not being provided, the movement of jobs out of the country, all of the other causes where you can point to the finger of capitalism as the cause of the problem. The distraction from that is to suggest that helping people with medical care, education, and so on is the cause of economic distress. It's actually the opposite. Well, I wish I could go on. I wish I could answer the other questions that I had chosen, but we have run out of time. So I will hold over the other questions. I will mention to you what they're concerned about. What happened in the Soviet Union? Why did socialism collapse there? That's one question. What is this struggle over net neutrality, the effort of Verizon and other companies to be able to control access to the internet and make money off of it? What's that about? And finally, what's the relationship between technology and globalization in undercutting jobs in the West? Fascinating questions. You're sending to me more than I can answer. We are enormously appreciative. Please continue to communicate with us. It helps us make this program as good as we can make it. This is Richard Wolff for Economic Update. Thank you for being with me, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Yes, it is.